Hi, everybody. So, today we shall be discussing the poem Beethoven by Shane Koyczan. And this is one of the new topics that has been included for the ISC 2025 onwards examination. So, I definitely hope this video will help all those of you who are watching this to understand what this poem is about, how to go about questions, what exactly the themes are, what the questions might be like. Essentially, everything you need, kind of like a last minute revision, if you will, for this poem, Beethoven. But also, my aim in recording these videos is not just to help prepare you for exams, but also just to help my listeners, viewers, whatever you are, to appreciate these poems essentially. And that's what the aim of teaching English, according to me, is. You need to love literature, and that's what it's all about. So today we shall be discussing once again Beethoven by Shane Koyczan. Now, as we go into this poem, the first thing we need to know is that Shane Koyczan, he intended for this poem to be spoken. So it is in the form of spoken poetry. It is the kind of poem that has to be experienced. It really brings to life so many senses. And the first person we need to talk about is Beethoven himself, because he is the central focus of this entire poem. So, who was Beethoven? Ludwig van Beethoven. He was born in 1770 and he died in 1827. He was one of the greatest composers to have ever walked this earth. He was born to a musical family and he was a precociously gifted pianist and violist. He was well known as both a virtuoso and a composer, and he was the first important composer to earn a successful living while forsaking employment in the church or court. Now, Beethoven wrote in the classical and romantic eras. He was rooted in the traditions of composers such as Haydn and Mozart, and his art also encompassed the new spirit of humanism expressed in the works of German romantic writers. Now, for the sake of your examinations, these are some points that are good to know, but they're not necessarily going to be asked in your ISC examination. But then we do have to build a bit of context as to who Beethoven really was. But definitely, a few of his compositions that some of you may have heard are Midnight Sonata and Für Elise. So definitely give those a listen also if you want to know the kind of work Beethoven actually created. Now let's talk about the poem Beethoven. The poem Beethoven by Shane Koyczan, it delves into the life and struggles of renowned composer Ludwig van Beethoven, and it uses his story as a metaphor for the power of passion, perseverance, and the pursuit of greatness. In this poem, we see how Beethoven struggled through obstacles and how he overcame all kinds of obstacles to really become one of the greatest of the greats. The poem suggests that Beethoven's father was physically abusive, and historically we have known that Beethoven's father was an alcoholic, and possibly he was driven by the desire to mold his son into a genius. So there is definitely a theme here of parental pressure. There's a theme of parents having a profound effect or impact on their children, and often that impact takes a negative turn. Despite the harsh environment and lack of recognition attached to his family name, Beethoven found solace in music. This poem highlights his dedication to perfecting each note, using his talent as a means to earn praise and escape the turmoil surrounding him. So, this theme of validation and this theme of appreciation also plays quite a role in this poem. The mention of Beethoven's hearing loss is significant, as it depicts the profound impact it had on his musical career. Now, talking about the real life Beethoven, in his later years, he suffered from severe to almost total hearing loss. and his deafness was a great impediment or obstacle to him creating some of his greatest compositions. Despite that, Beethoven made some of the most famous musical compositions ever. Even without being able to hear his own compositions or the applause of his audience, Beethoven continued to pour his heart and soul into his work. The poem emphasizes that his love for music went beyond personal gain, becoming an addiction that drove him to create extraordinary compositions. The poem Beethoven also touches on the skepticism and attempts to ridicule Beethoven's unconventional musical techniques. We'll talk about that a little bit once we move into our text. However, his genius was undeniable, eventually forcing even the most skeptical to acknowledge his brilliance. The lyrics suggest that the deaf have a unique connection with silence, and Beethoven's inability to hear, and that's an important point, it allowed him to explore the depths of both sound and stillness, leading him to create music that resonated deeply with people. The poem concludes by emphasizing that understanding Beethoven doesn't require knowing the intricacies of his history. You don't really need to go into detail regarding his life, his childhood, all the obstacles he overcame. At the end of the day, what truly matters of an artist is the work that they give you, the art that they create. It encourages the audience to simply listen, allowing the music to tell his story and inspire a profound emotional connection. In essence, Beethoven speaks to the universal themes of resilience, passion, and the transformative power of art. And those are some of the most important ideas that this poem deals with. So you can definitely expect questions based on these ideas. The importance of resilience, the importance of passion, and how art transforms us as people. The poem celebrates the ability of music to transcend barriers and touch the hearts of listeners, leaving a lasting impact that goes beyond words. All right, it's time now that we've got our introductions out of the way. We've read about Beethoven, the person, we've read about what the poem essentially is about. But now it is time for us essentially to read through and dissect this poem. So do make sure you have your notebooks with you, because we are going to be digging a little deep into the text of this poem. The poem begins very interestingly. It begins with one word, and the first word is listen. His father made a habit out of hitting him. So clearly his father has been abusive. See, some men drink, some men yell, some men hit their children. This man did it all. Now, at the very outset, as this poem opens, we learn that Beethoven's father is abusive, and we learn that this child, Beethoven, is growing up in difficult circumstances. Because as it says, some men drink, some men yell, some men hit their children. But this man, Beethoven's father, he did it all. Because I guess, and it's interesting how the poet uses the first person here, I guess, all men want their boys to be geniuses. Now, isn't this unfortunately the sad reality of so many people, even in today's day and age? So many parents want their children to become geniuses. But the thing is, everybody is different. And all parents must understand that it's okay for children not to be geniuses. However, Beethoven's father wanted his boy to be a genius. Now notice how the poet uses lines over here. Some of the lines simply have one word. For example, the opening line, it's just one word, listen. Similarly, after what I just explained, the next line just says, Beethoven, little boy, So just one or two words. It's very snappy. It's almost like there's a musicality to these lines. Beethoven, little boy, living in a house where a name meant nothing. So perhaps Beethoven's father wanted the family name to mean something. And maybe he saw Beethoven as a way to earn that, to achieve that. Beethoven, a little boy, living in a house where a name meant nothing. Living in a house where mercy had to be earned. Through each perfect note tumbling up through the roof. So again, the difficult situation of Beethoven's home life is being brought out over here. And there's a very significant line here that says, mercy had to be earned through each perfect note. So again, the relationship between Beethoven and his father, it was difficult because his father was abusive and mercy had to be earned. Kindness had to be earned by Beethoven by playing his notes perfectly. Notice the strange irony over here. Because the notes are not tumbling down. When things tumble, they usually move in a downward direction. But here, the poet uses the term tumbling up through the roof. To tickle the toes of angels. Did you hear the alliteration in that line? Tickle the toes of angels, whose harps couldn't hold half the passion that was held in the hands of a young boy who was hard of hearing. So, initially, what these lines mean is that the music would soar up to the heavens. The notes would tumble up through the roof and angels would be delighted by that. Their toes would be tickled by it. The harps of angels. I'm sure you've seen angels, holding harps, carrying harps, playing harps in religious scripture. But their harps couldn't hold half the passion that was held in the hands of a young boy. So Beethoven's talent could rival that of what angels had, and his passion far more than what they did. Their harps couldn't hold half the passion that was held in the hands of a young boy who was hard of hearing. Beethoven, who heard his father's anthem every time he put finger to ivory. Now, I think it's very interesting that the poet uses the word anthem over here. Now, we have anthems for our country. We have anthems for football teams, perhaps. An anthem is something that represents a group. It represents a place, for example. It's a song that's very representative of something. But Beethoven heard his father's anthem, and the irony here is that his father's anthem is not a song. It is a criticism of Beethoven. Every time he put finger to ivory. Can you guess what piano keys are made of? If you guessed ivory, you are correct. Every time he put finger to ivory, his father's anthem echoed. And what was his father's anthem? It was not good enough. So he played slowly, not good enough. So he played softly, not good enough. So he played strongly. So are you seeing, or are you able to hear rather, Beethoven's father's anthem echoing in our ears as well? Again, it's so relatable to what so many children go through today. Parents who are unhappy, parents who want so much more from their children. They're never content. It was not good enough is the father's anthem. So, what did Beethoven do? He played slowly, he played softly, and he played strongly. And all these times, he could hear his father's anthem, not good enough. Do realize, students, that the poet is using repetition over here. It's almost like a refrain in a song. When lines are repeated, when a chorus is repeated, when the chorus of your favorite song uh, shows up and you just want to listen to that over and over again. It's almost like that element of musicality that Shane Koyczan is using in this poem. Repetition. So when he could play no more, when his fingers cramped up into the gnarled roots of tree trunks, a beautiful metaphor over there, because Beethoven's fingers are getting cramped up through practice. If you've ever played an instrument or maybe learned a sport, you have to practice so much until you get absolutely sick of it. But Beethoven feels his fingers cramping up like the gnarled, twisted roots of tree trunks. But it was still not good enough. Let's move on to the next part of the poem. So, initially, we learn about Beethoven and his relationship with his father. We are now moving on to Beethoven as a composer. And let's see his career and his life and how that looks. And that's what the next part of the poem deals with. Beethoven. Again, we have that one word line. Beethoven, a musician without his most precious tool, his eardrums. And now we are moving into that stage of life where Beethoven starts losing his sense of hearing. Now, can you imagine a musician who is unable to hear the music he is creating? That's absolutely unbelievable, isn't it? But Beethoven was a musician without his most precious tool, his eardrums. He could no longer pound out rhythms for the symphonies playing in his mind. Even though he could not physically hear the music, he could hear it in his mind, and there were complete symphonies playing in his mind. He couldn't hear the audiences clapping, couldn't hear the people loving him, couldn't hear the women in the front row whispering, Beethoven, as they let the music invade their nervous system. And now the poet talks about the impact that Beethoven's music has on the public. So the people let the music invade their nervous system. It was like a drug that was coursing through their veins, like an armada, this fleet of ships going off to war, marching through firing cannonballs, detonating every molecule in their bodies into explosions of heavenly sensation. So all of this was the impact Beethoven has. Obviously, Shane Koyczan, the poet, is using a lot of metaphors over here. Like an armada, that's a simile. Cannonballs detonating every molecule in their bodies. That's the impact the music has. Beethoven's music has on people. Into explosions of heavenly sensation. Each note leaving track marks over every inch of their bodies, making them ache for one more hit. It's almost like a drug, as I said. He was the narcotic, and he was an addiction. The people loved him. And kings or queens, it didn't matter. The man got down on his knees for no one. Beethoven did not bow down to anyone but the music. He did not bow down to kings or queens. Music was his king. But amputated the legs of his piano. And now it's a very graphic example that Shane Koyczan gives us. Something that Beethoven is believed to have done in urban legend, but Shane Koyczan uses that legend in his poem also. Apparently, Beethoven actually cut off the legs of his piano so that he could feel the vibrations through the floor. The man got down on his knees for music. Now, Beethoven loved music so much, he was willing to go to such lengths. Even though he could not hear the music physically, he removed the legs of his piano. Why? So that he could feel the vibrations of the music through the floor. And that's a very significant line. It's a very important line that all of you can also quote in your answers. The man got down on his knees for music. Not for kings and queens, but for music. And when the orchestra played his symphonies, it was the echoes of his father's anthem repeating itself like a broken record. It was not good enough. And even when Beethoven makes it big, the orchestra is playing his symphonies, but he could still hear his father's anthem repeating itself. Not good enough. So they played slowly. Not good enough. So they played softly. Not good enough. So they played strongly. Not good enough. And again, it's like Shane Koyczan, the poet. He brings back this chorus. He brings back this refrain. And he repeats that once again. The father's anthem. Not good enough. And this is not Beethoven as a child anymore. It's Beethoven conducting the orchestra. So they tried to mock the man, make fun of the madness by mimicking the movements, holding their bows a quarter of an inch above the strings, not making a sound. Even the people, rather the musicians in the orchestra, at some points, even they tried to mock Beethoven. They tried to make fun of the madness. And notice how Shane Koyczan uses the word madness, which makes us wonder, is madness another name just for genius? You be the judge of that. But the people in the orchestra made fun of the madness by mimicking the movements, holding their bows a quarter of an inch above the strings, not actually playing it, not making a sound, pretending to play it, mimicking the movements. It was perfect. See, the deaf have an intimacy with silence. And that's a very important quote that I would like to maybe highlight for our class today. The deaf have an intimacy with silence. A very significant quote. You can expect questions on something like this. What does this mean? Essentially, it means that the deaf who only know silence, there's nobody closer to silence than the deaf are, essentially. It's there in their dreams. And the musicians turned to one another, not knowing what to make of the man. So even though the orchestra was not making sounds, right? The orchestra isn't really playing. They're pretending to play. They think he's mad. However, there is still a symphony playing. And where is that symphony playing? It is playing in Beethoven's mind. Because Beethoven, who is now deaf, he has an intimacy with silence. And the orchestra continues to play. The symphony plays in his mind and in his heart. It's there in his dreams. And the musicians turned to one another, not knowing what to make of the man, trying to calculate the distance between madness and genius. So again, this really reflects society. Society will brand people, usually genius people, as mad. Right? People like Steve Jobs have been called mad in their lifetime. But in retrospect, when we look back at the life they have lived, the work they have done, we know that they really were geniuses. And the musicians look at one another wondering, is this man really mad? And they're trying to wonder, could he possibly be a genius or is he just mad? Realizing that Beethoven's musical measurements could take you to distances reaching past the towers of Babylon. We have a little bit of an allusion over here. That's allusion spelled with an A. And an allusion essentially is a reference to a piece of literature or a piece of history possibly. Babylon, the ancient city of Babylon, a city with vast towers, great architecture. You've probably heard of the Gardens of Babylon. And Beethoven's musical measurements would take you past those towers of Babylon. And that's how amazingly epic his music was. And we have a series of metaphors now, a lot of cosmic, astronomical images that are coming up next. Because Beethoven's music, according to the poet, turned solar systems into symbols that crashed together. And I really am a fan of the pun over here. The symbols, also symbols, CYMBALS, symbols, the percussion instrument that crashes together in a drum set. A little bit of a pun over there. But Beethoven turned solar systems into symbols that crashed together, causing comets to collide, creating crescendos that were so loud they shook the constellations, until the stars began to fall from the sky. Did you notice how the poet is also using a lot of alliteration here? Crashed, causing comets collide, creating crescendos. A lot of alliteration, a lot of consonants that is making the sound so musical. It's almost like this poem itself is a composition. And I really appreciate that. Creating crescendos that were so loud they shook the constellations until the stars began to fall from the sky. A series of metaphors that really bring out how amazing Beethoven's contribution was and how his music made people feel. And it looked like the entire universe had begun to cry. Beethoven's music could move the entire universe. Now, again, metaphorically, we can look at this as just a bit of a connection to art and how art can move people. If you are an artist in any way, if you sing or if you write or if you draw, if you paint, if you make music, you must believe that you can make the entire universe cry with your creation, because that's what Beethoven did. Distance must be an illusion. So people realize that the distance between, again, we have this little connection to this line I had marked earlier. The line about the distance between madness and genius. That distance must be an illusion. The man must be a genius. Beethoven, his thoughts moving at the speed of sound, transforming emotion into music. I also think it's very interesting that the poet uses the term speed of sound, because this is a poem that talks about sound. It's a poem that depends so much on sound. Transforming emotion into music. Think of your favorite songs, students, if you're listening right now. Think of your favorite song. How does that emotion transform through the music? How is that music brought to life? How is that emotion connecting to you through that music? And that's what Beethoven did again, transforming emotion into music. And for a moment, it was like joy was a tangible thing, something you can touch, like you could touch it. Like for the first time, we could watch love and hate dance together in a waltz of such precision and beauty. So it's like love and hate coming together, waltzing together. Again, a beautiful metaphor here of a waltz, a very classy dance. We have love and hate interacting with each other, dancing in precision and beauty. That we finally understood that, I'm just going to mark these lines because they're very significant. History wasn't important to know the man. All we ever had to do was listen. And the poem ends the same way it begins, with the same word. You must listen. You don't need to know the man. You don't need to know his history. You don't have to know about his childhood or his experiences with the orchestra, his deafness. All you have to do is just listen to what Beethoven had to say. And that brings us to the end of our explanation, students. I really hope that helped all of you. I do have a couple more slides that you can always screenshot, you can note down, you can use those for your revision as well. But in terms of the main discussion of the poem, I definitely hope that helped all of you. So moving on to our analysis section of the poem Beethoven. The first thing we need to know is that Beethoven falls under the genre of spoken word poetry. Now, spoken word or spoken word poetry is a poetic form that is meant for performance. I'm sure while I was reading the poem, you could tell that maybe it's a very auditory experience. You have to listen to the poem performed because there's so much wordplay, there's so much alliteration, there's so much intonation in this poem. And that's what a spoken word poem is. I'm sure you've heard of today's movements. For example, we have slam poetry, which takes its roots from spoken word poetry. So it's definitely a very modern form of poetry. The poem opens and ends with a single word imperative. An imperative word is a word that gives you a command, tells you to do something. And what is that word? Listen. It commands the reader to pay attention, absorb Beethoven's iconic music. Certain words are emphasized, if you noticed. Words like not good enough, those are emphasized for dramatic effect. It brings out his own self-criticism and his desire for perfection. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there is repetition. Just like a good song repeats some of your favorite lines over and over. For example, we have not good enough. And then the following lines, so they played slowly, so they played strongly, etc. It brings out a sense of drilling, as if this young man, he's being forced to practice over and over and over again. And Beethoven himself was subjected to that, and arguably we can say he subjected himself to that. He made himself practice so many times intensely. There's also a bit of irony. For example, we have the line, a musician without his most precious tool, his eardrums. There's a lot of images, I'm sure, that all of you all could imagine as the poem was being read out. We have the setting of the house. We have an armada, for example. We have cannonballs. We have all those cosmic images, the entire universe, the solar systems. And all of that imagery comes together to create this wonderful sensory experience. A lot of metaphors, a lot of similes also that really make this poem what it is. For example, tickle the toes of angels. Beethoven wasn't literally doing that. That would be weird. But his music was so moving that it's almost like the angels would hear it and the angels would enjoy that. We have this metaphor of the gnarled roots of tree trunks, right? It's like Beethoven playing the piano and his hands getting completely cramped and completely twisted almost, like the gnarled roots of tree trunks. Like an armada is a simile, like a broken record is a simile. There's alliteration, there's consonance, right, which is the repetition of consonant sounds. You have crashed together, causing comets to collide, creating crescendos. By the way, crescendos are this rise in the music. In case I didn't discuss that word earlier, but in music, a crescendo is this build-up where the music reaches its absolute peak before it crashes into the final parts. It's also interesting that the poet uses cosmic imagery, a lot of references, I would say, to the universe itself. And that cosmic imagery takes the poem to very spiritual levels. There's a mention of the solar system, comets, right? Constellations, the universe. And as I said earlier, it really brings out how one person's art can really create a dent in the universe and how you can change the universe just with your art. You can make that large of an impact. Finally, Before we end our class for the day, let's look at some of the themes, some of the main ideas of this poem. Definitely, I think a lot of questions for your council examinations will be based on some, if not all, of these themes, all just coming together. Okay, so first of all, we have creativity, and we see how it's so life changing, it's so universe changing to create something. Beethoven is a creative genius, and his music has impacted us over the centuries. The second theme we are talking about is resilience, right? What we mean by resilience essentially is this idea of not giving up, even in the face of obstacles, whether it was pressure from his father, it was abuse from his father, it was the mocking from the orchestra, right? Beethoven never gave up. He was resilient. He kept going. And because he was resilient, he created the works that we know and love today. Another important theme is the third one. It is the acceptance of one's flaws and also constantly improving to become better. Now, Beethoven was definitely talented, but I really don't want to give his father much credit for this, but Beethoven did work on his flaws. And there's a bit of a reference in the poem where it's almost like he plays the piano so many times, his fingers become like gnarled roots of tree trunks. It's because he wants to improve, because he wants his flaws to be reduced, right? So, that persistence, that resilience, again, coming back over there, we must learn from Beethoven. And that's a very important theme also. Of course, we have the fourth theme, which is what we began the poem with, and that's the influence of parents. Whether you call that pressure, whether you just call that tough parenting, say what you will about it, but Beethoven's father did help to make Beethoven the man he became. It was very difficult, his father being an alcoholic, being abusive, and so on. But at the same time, that was an obstacle for Beethoven to overcome. And Beethoven had to prove himself to his father as well. And therefore, if the father wanted the family name to mean something, and Beethoven made that happen. Coming to point number 5, I think point number 6 is pretty much something we've discussed before, but talking about art and how universal that is, right? The poem discusses how Beethoven has shifted the solar system essentially. Comets collide, constellations are shaken, right? The universe is shaken to its core because of one man's music. So that's the power of art. If you are a creator and if you're listening to this, I hope you take this as inspiration. If you create art, if you're an artist, if you're a singer, if you're a songwriter, if you're a writer, if you're a poet, no matter what kind of art you make, if you create art on the sports field, please go ahead and do that. Create a dent in the universe. I think that's the best message this poem has left us with. And just weaving point number 6 into this, there definitely will be obstacles in your path, just as there were in Beethoven's path. But, it is the possibility of making dreams come true. It is the possibility of overcoming obstacles that make our lives interesting. And that's something we must not forget. So students, I really hope you all enjoyed this analysis, this discussion of the poem Beethoven. I understand this has turned out to be quite a long video, but I definitely enjoyed talking about this, and I hope it really helps all of you. If there's any more topics you really would like me to discuss, do put that in the comments below. If any of my students are listening, it's good to see all of you here again. I wish you the very best for your examinations. Do feel free to like or subscribe or whatever it is you kids say these days on the YouTubes. I'm not that old, but anyway, I hope this video really helped all of you. Have a great day, everybody, and I shall see all of you in the next one.